And when you had a fasting day, what specifically did that look like? I know in the book you talked that it's kind of different from Lent and like other times, but yeah, if you could kind of just go through some of those options of, okay, you're waking up, it's a Wednesday, it's a
Mhm.
Friday, it's a day in Lent,
Mhm.
like what do you do on that day to fast?
Right. So that also differs over time. So in the very early church, if it's a fasting day, of course it means no meat's allowed, but it also means you're only having one meal, and that one meal is had after sunset only. So you're going to wait all day till after sunset, that you're going to have your meal, and that's it. And it's going to be a vegan meal because abstinence very early on wasn't just vegetarian, it was vegan. And that went on really until the 6th century. So by that time, in the 6th century, you have Pope St. Gregory the Great changing what abstinence means, and you can have fish for the first time. So it's important to note that, I think, because so many people, I think, allege sorts of lies against the church, that the church, allows fish on Fridays because it enriched itself early on because the apostles were fishermen, and that's how they became so wealthy. I mean, that's just absurd. Because for 6 centuries you could not even have fish most of the year as part of this. So that's just outright debunked right there. But that's how fasting was done for a long time. By the year 817, you have monks for the first time ever that they could start to have something called a collation, another snack that eventually was just liquid like wine, and then it turned into, well, it could be like a morsel of bread. And this was for the monks because if you're aware of, like, the book How the Church Built Western Civilization, monks aren't just sitting around praying all day. They're out in the field working all the time. They're heavily manual labor, and they're cultivating the land, and they're Christianizing Europe, but they're also doing everything that we see now of building Europe physically. So they are allowed this refreshment in the evening, and then that begins to spread to the faithful. And this is kind of how it was practiced for a long time. By the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, then you had a little bit different of what time the meal could be had, though. So by this point, the meal time was moved up to 3 o'clock in honor of that was the hour in which Christ died. So if it was a fasting day, you could have it at 3 o'clock for the most part. And you could have that second snack, collation, just a small amount in the evening. Definitely by the time of St. Alphonsus Liguori, around the 17th century or so, you have the practice in some places of you could have a small morning snack as well called a frustula. And, together those should be quite small. Remember, your main meal is had at noon, but by that point, well, we can move it up. At 3, by this point, let's move it up and have it at noon. So your meal time is now moved to noon. You can have these other two snacks. Um, by the time of America, unlike the Baltimore Council here, people familiar with the Baltimore Catechism, but the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in their manual even published guidelines for you should weigh these to make sure they're not too much. That's how much strictness the church
Hmm.
was looking at this to make sure, like, well, make sure that collation snack isn't too large. Weigh it; it should be no more than 8 ounces, and the morning one should be no more than 2 ounces. And there were also rules regarding what you could have. So, for instance, you couldn't have butter because butter would be an animal product. But maybe you could have chocolate. I talk about in the book when chocolate was discovered in the New World. There was a debate: is it a liquid or a solid? If I leave it out, it melts, but I mean, it freezes here. And there was debate on whether or not the chocolate could be had with the frustulum. And all of this is said because people for a long time took fasting and abstinence very seriously. So the question of is this meat or not, is this allowed, was very serious a question. Is this too much food or not, was seriously considered. That's why these manuals are put out. That's why we have these guidelines. That's why theologians, moral theologians, are talking about this. Not because it doesn't matter, because it matters a lot. Because to intentionally violate the laws of fast and abstinence is a mortal sin. And I feel like priests nowadays are hesitant to remind people that was affirmed by multiple popes and taught without hesitation that the church's precepts, the going to mass on Sundays, for instance, the observance of the church's laws on marriage, of an Eastertide communion, and of, fasting and abstinence, that these all bind mortally. So if you are obliged to fast, you are in the ages that you have to fast, and you physically can, then yes, you to fail to do so is a mortal sin. You must go to confession. So, I mean, you risk your own soul going to hell for eternity because the church has the power by Christ to command this. And that's something I also talk about too in my writing, especially in the book, because I find the history very interesting, but it's important to understand too, the church has this authority because Christ gave it to her. And unlike some people that allege we avoid certain foods because they're evil, because for instance, some pagan religions taught like evil demons would hide in certain foods, like you would avoid meat because demons were in there. So by eating it, then you ingested a demon. That's not the case at all. You know, the sin is the disobedience because a legitimate authority in the church says you may not consume this thing on this day or at this time. That's the violation. And because we do not observe that, that's why it becomes a mortal sin. So important to keep that in mind too, that it all comes down to obedience. And obviously men, of course, we should be the most obedient to God. That's the first priority, the observance of the commandments of God and the commandments of the church, also known as the precepts. That comes number one. And then after that, you can focus on, you know, how to sanctify my family life. How do I balance my work-life commitments? How do I make time for other things? That ordering of responsibilities in the home has to always be subordinated to the laws of God and the laws of the church. So understanding what the church teaches regarding fasting and abstinence is very important because we have to observe these laws. They do bind under penalty of sin. The same would be applied to with the Eucharistic fast for Holy Communion. A lot of consideration was paid to what do I eat? I mean, what can I eat? What can I drink? What can I not? So much so, like even theologians would be like, because for a long time I'll tell people, really until the 1950s, you could not eat or drink anything before Holy Communion from midnight on. And that was the case for centuries and centuries. But people would be like, well, I'm getting an IV, like I'm taking in liquid through an IV. Does that violate the fast? People were very seriously concerned about things like this. Or I accidentally swallowed my tooth when I'm sleeping. Did I eat? Can I go to Holy Communion today? Of course, the faithful didn't receive communion as often back then, especially before Pius X's time in early 1900s. But so this was all kind of considered, all going back to, it's important to understand the history. Things change. People want to, of course, observe what the church commands. But unfortunately, through it all, there does tend to be, especially over the centuries, a minimalism that emerges. People are intent on, well, what do I have to do? I want to make sure I observe it, but I'm just going to make sure I don't commit a sin. And we've reached the point now where we have so little fasting and abstinence that we have to say the minimum is beyond easy. I want to go above and beyond the minimum. I want to put myself, so to speak, back in these early eras and try to observe the fast as if I lived then. And then I will reap benefits from doing so. I do so voluntarily, but I unite myself to my ancestors who did so under obligation. And I'll use that as a roadmap to how to sanctify my own life with fasting and abstinence. So that's what I encourage people to do. We learn it not just for history lessons, not because it's just interesting. We want to know where phrases like when in Rome, do as Roman do come from. We do this because this is the roadmap for us to how to become holy in the, this particular century.
Mm-hmm. Thinking through the obligation that you mentioned, and even with that in there, I know that there is the instinct to kind of ask, okay, maybe there were prolific writing saints that discussed this, or maybe, right, there were these moral theologians either in monasteries or later in the church's history at universities that were discussing this. But I know that there is an instinct to kind of question, but how really was this followed? Did the people actually do this? This might be the documents that kind of came out of the time, but was this really followed? And I wonder if you could kind of talk to those kind of doubts or those questions of if we have kind of more evidence of the truly kind of common peasant working class people that they were actually kind of going through in this, they were eating once a day in Lent and things like that. If you could kind of speak to that.
Yeah, so there's no doubt that the faithful did so throughout the centuries. One thing I'll note is that we have examples in testimony for some of the martyrs and how they observed the fasting. So I talk about in the book that in the very early church, you could not even have water on a fasting day until you broke your fast after sunset with your meal. And there's testimonies of a bishop who was martyred in Spain. And I think it's really prolific to consider what he went through with these tortures, but he's being led to execution, and he's being offered a drink. And this wasn't even during Lent. This was during a weekly devotional fast on a Wednesday or a Friday. And he refuses the drink because he said it was not the hour to break the fast. And he would break the fast in heaven because he would not have any water whatsoever and violate the law of the church. So, I mean, obviously, people now be like, obviously, there's some sort of, circumstances that permit you to not have to observe this. But he didn't. And, we have that testimony as well. And we looked through a lot of older catechisms, and I did so. There were all these questions on who is exempt and dispensed from the law of fasting and abstinence. And, there's different categories of people, from those who had too much physical labor to pregnant and nursing women to the sick and infirm. And what does it mean to be too sick and infirm to actually observe these laws? But the fact that you had all these people asking about this and writing about this show people generally were interested in whether or not they were dispensed or not. And also, obviously, that fasting began at a certain age and ended at a certain age. Absence began at a certain age, but never ended. It would go for the end of your life, and still is the case. So when you are bound by absence, you are bound for the rest of your life. Doesn't mean at you're 85, 90 years old, you still cannot eat meat on a prohibited day. You might be exempt from fasting, though, but some people who are still even legitimately exempted would still continue to observe it. So we see this as well in the evidence of these catechisms and writings. We see this well clearly in church history, because as I document in the book, the death of fasting and absence was death by 1,000 dispensations. If people didn't care and they broke it anyway, they wouldn't be like, I want a dispensation, for this area or for this region or for this particular thing. And, we want to latch on to that and use it. And that's what people did over centuries. That's how fasting and absence was weakened. As we, talk about before, what does it mean to be meat? Gregory the Great allowed fish, but eventually we have, muskrat being allowed, beaver being allowed in certain places, puffin being allowed, capybara being allowed. Things you look at and you're like, that's not a fish, but your dispensations offered. Dispensations for crusaders offered. Dispensations for family members if if the father's a sailor or in the army and it's in a wartime. So that way he maybe would be dispensed with, the family wouldn't, but that would be unbecoming that they wouldn't be able to eat together. So we're going to issue dispensation for all of them. All of these are a preponderance of evidence to show that people generally saw these out and they were granted by the Holy See, or the Holy See gave authority to bishops who then could issue these dispensations. So that's very clear as well. And thirdly, we can definitely see this was the case too in the food customs. So in another book that I wrote on restoring the lost customs of Christendom, which I published last December, one of those customs throughout all these different liturgical seasons usually centers around food. And if we look at like the food customs, for instance, during Eastertide now, after Lent has ended, they're just full of different meat dishes and egg dishes and things that people were otherwise not able to eat. Whereas the food customs, for instance, in Lent were mainly over things like pretzels, things that were entirely vegan. Or traditionally on St. Joseph's Day, it was not zeppelis people would have, which is more of a modern thing, with obviously dairy products in there. Traditionally, it was things like sawdust pasta, which was breadcrumbs and other things entirely vegan. And St. Joseph's tables were vegan for a long period of time, too. So we look at the food customs people observed, they were observing the laws of the church as well. And society went along with it, too. I talk about in the book that it was a crime, for instance, to eat or serve meat in certain places on Friday. Rightfully so, because the civil authority wanted to ensure that souls were being saved, too. So it was an offense civilly to do so. And this remained the case even in Anglican England for a while. There were royal proclamations against eating of meat on prohibited days. And we even see modern society going along with it. That's why, thankfully, we still see Friday specials for fish and vegetarian items now. And that's really because of the influence of Catholics. Of course, Catholics are why McDonald's had the fish sandwich, because they lost all the money on Friday. Then nobody was coming to their stores, so they decided in the 50s to put a fish sandwich on the menu. And that is the impact Catholics can have. But the food traditions alone, too, are very clear. So there's a lot of reasons we can look at to say, like, was this just published and nobody did it? No, people cared about the faith. They lived the faith. If you call yourself a Catholic, you have to observe the Catholic faith. We obviously have our shortcomings. We have confession there if we mess up, but you can't just say, I'll be Catholic and this is not important. I'm not going to bother observing it. That's as ludicrous as saying, I'll be a Catholic, but I don't have to go to Mass on Sundays. I'll go whenever I want. That is not the case. That's the same as violating intentionally some of the commandments. We strive to always do better, but there is no reality in which we can say that these don't apply to us. The commandments of God and the church apply to everybody who the church says they do.
Thank you for watching The Making of Man. If you like that and want more, click here. And don't forget to like and subscribe.